So speech arrest or speech delays can certainly be a flag and an early marker of later learning challenge. So a parent who says, she was almost 2 when she said her first words, around 2.5 when she started to speak in sentences. So will I say definitively that this is a child who will show a learning disability? No, but certainly they are at elevated risk, okay? Difficulty understanding and processing auditory information. So things like ability to follow even short directions, pointing to objects when named, certainly may be an indicator of some language or auditory processing challenge, a motor skill delay, frustration, tolerance, or expression. Okay, so Johnny's teachers say that instead of asking to share or saying, I don't want to share, he grabs or pushes, right? That may be one indication that they really have trouble expressing their frustration really through linguistic means. Okay, so in terms of some of these competencies, so let me talk about some of the early markers during the pre-K and kindergarten period. So during this period, these kids basically begin to understand print concepts. And so, how to hold a book, that it's right side up, that in the beginning of the book there's the title, the name of the author, okay? That's what we really mean by book handling, from left to right, or if we're talking about Hebrew, from right to left. The understanding that print certainly can provide them with information, okay? So, I have twins, they're 5 years old, they're in kindergarten right now. They've already grasped at this point that, that they can gain information from reading, that it certainly provides them with sort of a path to learning something. They recognize that sentences are comprised of words. They certainly will develop, early even during this period, letter recognition and sound symbol correspondence. And so one of the things that I will often do for kids at this age, pre-K and kindergarten, is I will show them symbols and ask them to learn associations between those symbols and certain sounds, right? So I may show them, a circle and say, okay, this means ha, okay? Show them a line going this way. This means T, right? So I'm basically presenting them with symbol sound pairings and testing their ability to learn those associations, because that's something that is so critical for reading, is making links between symbolic information, letters, and the sounds that correspond with those letters, okay? Okay, and then finally, things like phonemic awareness, okay? The ability to sort of break words up into segments, the ability to rhyme, produce rhyming sounds, identify rhyming sounds, okay? So these are all really kind of critical skills that kind of govern reading. What are some red flags during this period? Okay, again, the pre-K, kindergarten periods. So certainly speech onset delays, as we had already talked about. If we see what we call circumlocution, if they really have a hard time finding the word that they want to use and instead really kind of talk around something because they can't find that word, that may be an indication. Difficulties with rapid naming, okay? And so, again, one of the things that we'll do as part of our evaluations oftentimes is show kids, certainly during this early age, in fact I did it just today, this morning, we may show them shapes of different sizes, of different geometric forms, of different color, and so they might say, this is a big blue circle, this is a small red square. And we have them do this as quickly as they can, and we look at the accuracy and their speed. Why is this relevant? Because this is also very, very pivotal to reading. Not only do we have to really make sound symbol associations, but we have to do it with some level of automaticity. We have to be able to kind of rapidly decipher symbolic information in order to read accurately. Kids who have difficulty rhyming, learning the alphabet, some of these basic sort of readiness concepts, colors, shapes, days of the week. Now again, these are not necessarily definitive indicators, okay? And many of these issues are developmentally normal at certain ages, but if they persist or show real difficulties responding to intervention or instruction, that might be a signal of continued difficulty. In terms of writing, okay, so during, again, this early period, some will write with an inverted fist, so, what we might think of as kind of a very kind of basic rudimentary grip. Some are going to kind of hold their hands and just kind of thumb opposing all fingers. And some, by around 4.5, should use kind of a more mature, kind of what we refer to as a tripod grasp. Now, parents will often ask about letter reversals, particularly during this age, and will often sort of begin to catastrophize and raise concerns that these letter reversals may be a marker of later dyslexia. So, here's a yes/no question. You have a 50-50 chance. So, are letter reversals a clear, definitive marker of dyslexia? What do we think? No. Right, exactly. So letter reversals have been shown to be more common among individuals with dyslexia, but are certainly by no means a mandatory or required pattern or symptom of dyslexia. Dyslexia simply refers to sort of an unexpected difficulty learning to read. And the reason why we say it's unexpected is because these kids otherwise have normal intelligence, they've been given adequate, appropriate instruction, but despite all of that, are really showing difficulties mechanically reading, learning sound symbol correspondence, and so forth. Okay. So red flags in terms of writing: if their motor control is very poor, they have difficulty generating basic line drawings, geometric patterns. If we're seeing functionally trouble, things like dressing, zippering, snapping, tying shoes, controlling writing implements, scissoring, and so forth, that may be an indication that writing could be problematic. In terms of math, okay, at this point in time, they're learning things like sorting into shapes and sizes, distinguishing quantities. They're learning about cardinality, like the number of items within a given set. They're beginning to tell time, learning about calendar concepts, and so forth, using manipulatives quite a bit at this age. In terms of red flags during the pre-K and the kindergarten period, so poor number sense. Okay, so if these kids at this age are really having trouble counting, trouble learning numbers, trouble differentiating between quantities, knowing, for example, that the number 8 is greater than the number 2, okay? If we're still seeing that at this point, that certainly may be a marker, because again, at this point, again, assuming that they're in school with some regularity, these are skills that really are being pretty extensively drilled in. So if they're showing difficulties despite that, that certainly may be some concern. Okay, elementary school, which granted is a large stretch of time, so lumping it together may not be entirely appropriate. But in terms of reading, so at this point, they should be able to start blending sounds together. Wa, ter, mel, un, right? So if I said that to you, bass, kit, ball, right? So that's sort of an exercise in sound blending. Can you take individual components and essentially blend them together to form words? Sound deletions, okay? So basically removing a part of a word and perhaps substituting, in the case of substitution, right? So say rope, okay, change the O in rope to I. Okay, so now they would have to say ripe, okay? So can they basically perform these sort of sound-related substitutions? Can they decode? Okay, and so the difference, by the way, between decoding and reading, so sight word reading involves basically giving kids regular everyday words and seeing can they identify those words. Decoding generally involves giving them non-words, made-up words that follow traditional rules. So, things like bimist, crumple, it's probably a real word, things like heffel, pragment, ska, brone, right? And the question is, can they apply these rules of phonics to sort of decipher that word that they've never seen before? Because what we'll see in some kids is that their letter word identification, their ability to sort of read traditional words may be fine because they've just memorized what that whole word looks like. But then, when you give them these sort of made-up words that you require them to decode and decipher that they've never seen before, but they have to apply these rules, they may have more difficulty. Okay, so and then fluency, which really kind of gets more at automaticity, how quickly they're able to recognize words. By third grade, we really begin to kind of make a pretty sizable shift. And many of you have probably heard this, perhaps even with your own kids. But third grade is really kind of a transition point where we kind of move or shift from learning to read to reading to learn. Okay, so this is the point where we really start to emphasize kind of getting meaning out of it, drawing conclusions, making inferences, answering questions about things that haven't really been explicitly asked, but that really require people to kind of read between the lines to be able to sufficiently answer. Being able to kind of comprehend figurative expressions like, he's the low man on the totem pole, right? So, if we come across an expression like that in reading, are we really able to kind of understand what that means? And not knowing these figurative expressions can certainly stand in the way of getting meaning out of what we're reading. Okay. So, red flags in terms of the elementary school years. So their inability to read pseudo words. And again, pseudo words are those kind of made up words that really require them to apply rules of phonics to get. If they can't blend sounds, if they're confusing basic words, if their reading speed seems very compromised, very labored, okay, and if they have trouble with comprehension. So look, there are lots and lots of kids that we will encounter in our practice that, can actually, and we see this a lot during the adolescent period, that can actually decode and decipher pretty accurately. But then you ask them questions about it, or you actually, have them read out loud for you, and what you find is that it's very slow, it's very labored, it's effortful, and they have to invest so much of their energy, so much of their resources to just being accurate in their reading, that it leaves, frankly, very little left over to be able to kind of get meaning out of it. And some of these kids will have to kind of go back a second time or a third time to get meaning out of it, because the first time they were just trying to be accurate. And so these are kids who will often require a lot of extra time, again, just because they have to take several passes at it before they can really get meaning out of it. Okay, so it's probably a little bit hard to see. This is an excerpt from a commonly used task that we do with kids called the Gray Oral Reading Test. And this is a nice task because we can get a lot of information very efficiently. So we have them read out loud for us, and we track the speed of their reading, we track the accuracy of their reading, and then we take it away and we actually ask them questions about what they read to see how much are they really just kind of getting through that first passage. And so in this example, this was a kid who actually just skipped a lot of words that he didn't know, and he would just say, I don't know, and he would just skip the words, okay? And it was very kind of slow in getting through this information. Okay, so in terms of writing during the elementary school years, okay, so, we will talk about things like phonetic spelling. So they use that knowledge of letter-sound correspondence, and we'll see that in some of their errors, like brought for brought, okay? Or they may overgeneralize or undergeneralize. A variety of different patterns may emerge, but the flags certainly can be, an over-reliance on the visual pattern of letters or the sound patterns if they cannot spell pseudo words, right? So we give them some of those pseudo words to spell. Again, that suggests real difficulties with sound letter correspondence. Okay, so here's a first grade spelling example. Okay, so things like cake, game, right? So we see some of these patterns coming across in how they're spelling. Here a little bit later at 8.5. And even just, some of this just, really begins to interfere with, being able to the outside reader to get much meaning out of this. So on the right, write about your favorite game, my favorite, right? So a lot of, one of the things that testing allows us to do is to really sort of finally dissect where some of their errors are existing. In terms of math, so calculation, all right, so basic automaticity, how quickly are they able to kind of pull up and solve these problems, knowing the steps, knowing the procedures. In word problems, what is important, what's extraneous, what's extra information that's kind of been thrown in there that I don't need, what are some keywords that are going to be important for me, like altogether or things like that. Okay, in terms of flags, so if number concepts don't stick, if they're having trouble with, let's say, multiplication, fact learning, if they have trouble telling time, remembering sequences, if we still, at 14, 15 years of age, see them counting on their fingers, so you certainly suggest that it hasn't necessarily reached automaticity by that point. Okay, and in terms of middle and high school, so at that point, in reading, we want to be able to really make predictions, extract what the main idea is, make inferences, be able to kind of visualize what is happening. And we sometimes make distinctions between narrative text, which really tells a story, and here we're focusing things on like where it took place, what the primary storyline is, who the characters are, versus more sort of expository text. So these might include things like learning directions, recipes, speeches, and just, even things like the structure of reading, knowing about topic sentences, cause and effect relationships, the sequence and chronology of the reading. In terms of high school, middle school, high school, red flags, so if their reading is very slow, if their comprehension is poor, if they have difficulty really extracting what the main idea is or making inferences out of that reading. And so one of the things that we will often encourage families or kids to do is to really sort of break it down into very, very minute fragments. So rather than reading entire chapters or perhaps even entire pages, to really sort of think on the scale of paragraphs, individual paragraphs, and to really begin to try to extract main ideas or key elements from individual paragraphs rather than on a much larger scale. Another thing that we will often do as far as our assessments go is to look and see, is there any difference between their listening comprehension and their reading comprehension? Are they much more effective in getting meaning when it's read to them as opposed to being read by them? Okay, there are some kids, particularly kids who struggle with sort of the more basic mechanics, who really get so sort of tripped up in the accuracy of their reading that it's really, really hard for them to get much substance out of it. And for some of those kids, and their parents may even come into us and say, look, if I could just sit there and read everything to them, they would be fine. And some kids actually do pretty well with audiobooks. And so it's not an uncommon recommendation, although I think we will often recommend audiobooks as sort of a companion or to be done alongside of them really sort of reading the traditional print themselves. Okay, in terms of writing during this period of time, the middle and high school period, so At this point, writing really becomes a very, if you will, executive process, okay? So much of the writing really involves planning, organizing, sequencing ideas, structuring how you're going to get the ideas across. In what sequence or what order the ideas are going to get conveyed, sort of thinking about organizing it into paragraphs, okay? How we effectively elaborate upon ideas, knowing how much detail the reader might need. So having some level of perspective. So, is this somebody who's going to be reading my work who knows nothing about what I'm writing about? Do they have some background already? Can I sort of get into sort of more limited detail knowing that they have some background? Okay, and so when we assess for writing as part of our evaluations, we, particularly essay-related writing, we focus on two issues primarily. One is the amount of detail that they give us, and the proxy for that is how many words they write. It's sort of a very gross estimate of how much detail they give, although certainly in no way does it get across the quality of the ideas. I mean, they can write the word "the" 600 times and they'd actually get a very high score for their word count. But the second is their theme development, their ability to sort of organize their ideas. So in that category, we're talking about things like, do they organize their ideas into paragraphs? Do they provide reasons to back up the arguments that they're trying to make? Do they elaborate on those reasons? Do they use transition terms? Do they have a coherent introduction? Do they have a coherent concluding paragraph? Okay, so it's really kind of getting, in some ways, at more structural elements of their writing.
Sorry to interrupt for 1 second. When the session is over, and no pressure, then I'm going the whole way down that way in between the next session for anybody who wants to. Okay.
Thanks. Okay, so in terms of red flags during this period, and again, middle school, high school period, so if they're writing in very short sentences that seem in some ways very kind of developmentally immature, that's certainly a flag. If they're writing in fragments or run-on sentences with their real structural issues attached to their writing, if their vocabulary seems to be very immature and underdeveloped, if they're continuing to make spelling errors, and this is certainly often, at least for me, kind of a bone of contention because at a certain point, and I don't say this to sort of minimize the importance of spelling. I mean, I think in older generations, perhaps spelling was something that was very sort of strongly emphasized. From my perspective, in some ways, it's sort of more important to kind of evaluate these kids on sort of the quality of their ideas and what they're really trying to get across, as opposed to their spelling. Now, obviously, if the spelling renders it incoherent and impossible to understand, then it's obviously problematic. But if it can be more readily resolved through a word processor or spell checker, then so be it. If they're having a hard time organizing their ideas, if they're sort of jumping from one topic to another and it just seems really so scattershot, that's problematic. If they never really sort of address the question that they're being asked to take up in their writing, so they're not really developing these themes, maybe they're answering a different question than the one that they've been asked to write about, that certainly can be problematic. Okay, so here again, some examples from a high school student. Number 27, it's supposed to be width. Okay, the next one, 28, is guitar. And some of these individuals may really have difficulty. You can see in the case of width, it's spelled correctly, but they weren't really able to kind of grasp the context in which the word was presented. So the width of the door was too narrow for the box to fit through, right? So being able to sort of, again, grasp that sort of homonym distinction based upon the context. Okay, in terms of math during this point, So certainly by now we're getting into fractions, decimals, long divisions, multi-step problems, algebra, geometry, and look, even in the Common Core, and again, as the parent of 5-year-old twins, it sometimes eludes the mind what these kids are coming home with these days. Algebraic concepts are even being woven into kindergarten now. Yeah, it's. I mean, again, with the idea that sort of the basic foundations, and granted, it's not high-level algebra, but it's. But they're trying to sort of lay the foundations for these skills that are going to be essentially evolve later on in their academic life. Even basic geometry. I was shocked when during the first month or two of school, my kindergarten kids came home and they were learning about vertices of geometric shapes in kindergarten. I mean, I'm pretty confident that I wasn't learning about vertices when I was in kindergarten. I can say that with pretty good certainty. So in terms of red flags, again, if their math flags are not fluent, okay, if they really have to sit there for long periods of time and solve even relatively basic calculation problems, if they don't use the correct operations, they may perform steps out of sequence, okay? Word problems is, again, often a real critical issue, and it's become even more paramount in the realm of the Common Core. And again, if there are real functional problems, they have trouble using money, trouble calculating tips, trouble determining sell prices, things like that. And problems showing their work. And this, by the way, is a real issue. Again, I don't mean to be I don't mean to deride the Common Core. I actually feel like it has some merit to it. But the Common Core is certainly something that has placed a real emphasis or premium on showing work. Even if the answer is right, if the work isn't there to back it up, problems, a lot of penalties for that. I'm sorry, yes, you have a question?
So my question is there a way to differentiate between, let's say like you come in and let's say you audit a student, is there a way to clearly identify a difference between an inherent learning disability and let's say a poor education? Like some kids just might be poorly educated, they may not know, like certain things are expected of them. Let's say like high school students, I've just seen like what you wrote up there in terms of sentence structure and math and so forth. Is there a way that you can clearly identify a learning disability versus someone who's just not educated or poorly educated?
Right, it's a great question. So what I would say is that if it really was sort of a casualty of poor education, then presumably many of the peers surrounding that individual would likely be suffering a similar fate, right? So their classmates might also have a similar set of challenges. And look, it's not so uncommon for a child to encounter, either, I don't say this to be pejorative, but a quote, bad teacher. And by that I don't necessarily mean an ineffective teacher, but maybe a teacher who just isn't able to really effectively reach that child, okay? So, but again, the assumption is that may be sort of more the exception than the rule, that it's not the case that the child is sort of in a stable way exposed to inadequate learning. So again, look, there are definitely communities, particularly in more urban communities, where education is inadequate, and it could certainly be an issue. And again, if that were to be the case, one should encounter pervasive problems. And actually we see it. I mean, we see in sort of more lower socioeconomic areas where educational funding is more limited, that these kids are just not performing nearly as well on state-related metrics. So I think for that reason, it's really important that our fact-finding be thorough and that we don't look exclusively at what we're gathering in the office in isolation, but we talk to the teacher, we go into the classroom, and we really try to get a feel for, how much of an outlier it is, or if it's really part of a broader pattern there. But thank you for your question. So, okay. So some social emotional signs. And I just put up a few quotes here of what parents might see experiencing from their kids. Lots of these kids are so insightful and they recognize it, and it really hurts them to be so learning challenged. And they realize that something is wrong because they can't do everything so equally. And there are some things that they can be very successful with and other things where they really struggle. Okay, so she's so smart, she knows she's struggling, she recognizes reading is hard for her. Last night he was hitting his head repeating, "I'm just so stupid." Okay. Getting Julia to read is like pulling teeth. So some of these kids will really be tremendously avoidant. They'll gravitate to things that make them feel successful and accomplished. And they'll really stray and shy away from things that really give them a run for their money. He doesn't let me check his homework anymore. I just completed an evaluation of an adolescent who's a junior in high school. And the dynamic between this child and the parents has become so negative. This will perhaps be forever etched in my mind. I remember they were leaving my office when I was reviewing the results of the evaluation. And the parent, the father in this case, was trying to sort of express to the child just how invested they were, and that they were sort of going through the exercise of the evaluation because they were really concerned about the child's well-being. And the child, and at one point the father went to kind of put his hand on the back of his son's back, and the son just sort of moved away. And so, even that sort of body language sort of showing me really how toxic that dynamic has become. And a lot of it was because the parents were micromanaging and they were really infiltrating, every sort of minute detail. They were going online, checking the portals, and it really became just a real stilted interaction that was developing. Changes in behavior, certainly self-esteem, self-concept. It can certainly escalate to school refusal or anxiety around school-related challenges or academic concepts. And some may just sort of respond and cope by being in just denial. In the interest of time, I'm just going to jump ahead. Some of these kids will certainly, quote, act oppositional. They may appear very inattentive or distractible. And one of the most common questions that we're often asked as part of our evaluation is to really disentangle, well, is this a learning disability? Is this some sort of attentional problem, right? Is the child struggling in the classroom because they seem to be really disengaged and detached? Is it because they have some academic problem and they're just really sort of tuning out? Are they academically capable but are really disengaged for some other reason? So these are kind of pretty common referral questions that we'll get in practice. So in terms of when to refer quickly, so certainly if there are diagnostic questions, so does the child have a learning disability, a developmental disability? If they're not making progress and they're not responding appropriately to intervention, for sure. And if we need to think about an appropriate academic setting for them, an evaluation could certainly answer a lot of questions. In terms of what parents, educators, others can do to be helpful, well, certainly, if you spot some of the signs, really open up a dialogue with the child's teacher. Think about evaluations to get a lot of these questions answered, and evaluations can certainly be highly, highly informative. And then finally, some good advocacy skills. So I put up here, the Department of Ed Bill of Rights, getting everything in writing, saving documents. And then lastly, some resources that I'll just leave up here that can be really helpful, in really advocating for kids' educational needs. So I think with that, I will stop. I'll take any final questions, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Hodgkin.